Welcome back to the channel, where today we are looking at the upcoming metagame for the Puerto Rico special event happening this weekend in Puerto Rico. Check it out. The first deck we have to look at here is Ceruledge EX. This deck honestly did not have a great weekend in Merida. It only had one deck coming in the top 64. So overall it really struggled, and I think Budu is just a very bad card for this deck in particular. The Itchy Pollen attack, just being able to really shut off Ceruledge's ability to grab items like Earthen Vessel, Ultra Ball, Nest Ball, the brilliant blender they use to really get their engine going, I think really makes it tough for Ceruledge to really have a good position in the meta right now. So I am going to be putting this deck in D tier, again, just because it really didn't have any success this past weekend at the regional. So I think that does continue. The next deck we have here is the Regidrago V-Star, a deck that is another deck that really gets hurt by Budu not being able to grab your energy switches, your Ultra Balls, Prime Catcher to set up big knockouts with your Drago V-Star. Makes it really tough for this deck to have success, and we saw that continue again in Merida, where again, same with Ceruledge, only one deck finishing in the top 64. So I think this deck will also struggle a lot this coming weekend in Puerto Rico. So I think again, this deck is a D tier deck right now. And unfortunately, with this being the last format, we'll have Regidrago in the standard format. It looks like the reign of Regi is kind of over at this point. Up next, we have Goldango, and this is a deck, the String Cheese Man, that I think is another one of these decks that really gets hurt by Budu, right? Not being able to grab your Energy Search Pro, which is really important for this deck to really get those early big knockouts, gets the energy in the discard, making your superior energy retrievals way more impactful later in the game. But again, this is a card in a deck that just really gets hampered by the Budu. And maybe in post rotation, it has a way better time. But I think for right now, this deck is kind of another D tier, kind of really struggles against Budu style of deck. Up next, we have probably one of the biggest surprises coming out of the Merida Regional Championships this past weekend is the Gouging Fire deck. This deck absolutely came out of nowhere, from a deck everyone thought was a meme to getting second in the event and really only losing that game 3 because he got donked. So this deck is so weird, so hard to gauge. I think this is kind of a C tier deck. I think it's a deck that if you put the time in, you do all the things to be really good with this deck, you could have a really good event. But I think also it just kind of shocked people, right? So now people are aware that you exist, and it will make things a lot more difficult for you. Up next, our first of our turbo decks, we have Miraidon, which had a really good event. There were 4 in the top 8. It was the deck that won the tournament, led by Azul Garcia Griego. Azul doing obviously his first regional in a long time, actually winning. I believe it's his first event since the Sacramento regionals back in November. Azul, obviously a very, very successful, very famous player, but able to win this with Miraidon, showing just how powerful this deck is. And I think the fact that half of the top 8 decks were Miraidon just really goes to show the strength of this deck in the current standard format. So I am putting it in the S tier. I think right now it's probably the best deck in the format until you kind of get proven otherwise. Up next, we have Raging Bolt, a deck very near and dear to my heart, but a deck that really did also kind of have some struggles. Obviously, I think it was probably because it had less people playing it, because Miraidon felt like such a much stronger deck than Bolt. But I think also Bolt just had kind of an odd event, right? Being that deck that people aren't looking to play as much as far as a turbo deck. I think this is probably the first event where Bolt hasn't been kind of the odds-on favorite for a turbo deck as far as placement. I think this is a B tier deck at the end of the day. I think it's good if you can get it to work, if you can avoid your rough matchups in the format, your controls, your Gardevoirs, things like that. If you can do that, you're gonna have a good time. Moving on to our last big turbo deck in the tier list, we have Roaring Moon EX. This deck is such an outlier. I think it's a deck that also kind of struggles against Budu. And honestly, it's a deck that had really rough placements this weekend. It had no day 2 decks in Masters. The only placement it has was a senior in Merida getting top 8. So for that reason, I think another deck that really gets hurt by Budu here. And also a deck that you have I feel like a really rough Dragapult match just because they really have a really good way to kind of six prize you in like 3 turns. So for Roaring Moon, I am putting it in the D tier as well. Another deck that is really finding a tough spot in the meta right now is Snorlax Stall. Blocklax being its final format before it rotates, really struggled this weekend in Merida. It had only 2 decks in the top 64, and neither of those decks able to place higher than 56th at the 1,200 person event. So for that reason, I'm also putting it in D tier. I think Control just does not have a great matchup right now in general, especially with Blocklax. Budu can kind of just shut off everything you do. Moving on to Quad Thorns. This is a deck that only had 1 placement in day 2 in Merida, but that was a top 16 placement. I think overall in the meta, this deck isn't in a great spot, but I think for this event, it was kind of a good like shock and awe kind of event where they could pull it out, do really well with that deck, and then probably move on to something else. For that reason, I'd probably put this at the bottom of C tier. I think it does have some good matchups in the format, but overall, I think it does struggle. Up next, we have Archaludon EX featuring the Dialga V-Star. This deck did not get a ton of play in day 2. It had a good amount of results, but not a lot of people doing overly successful with it in that day 2. The highest placement being 39th, but overall, there were 10 of these Archaludon decks in day 2. So I think it did have a good day, but not a great day. So for that reason, I'm going to place it in the B tier as well. Up next, we have Charizard EX, a staple in the Pokemon trading card game standard format since its release. This deck did not have a great weekend with it, but I think that's also just the fact that this is a new format, and I think people are still trying to figure out ways to utilize Budu, how to get around Budu, and all these different things, which I think does kind of hamper Charizard a little bit. I think Charizard is a deck that gets better in a more established format. So that is definitely something we will probably see later in the format. But for now, I would say for this weekend, it is probably a C tier deck. I think that it's going to continue to see some struggles, and maybe at EUIC in a few weeks, it'll really see some play. But I think for now, it's probably a deck I would steer away from unless you really feel confident with that deck. Up next, we have Lost Box, a deck that I personally thought we were done talking about, but Lost Box making its final stand here in the prismatic format. We had Andrew Hedrick making a huge play with this deck this past weekend, getting a top 32 finish with the Lost Box deck. That is honestly insane. It kind of has that same vibe as like Gouging Fire for me. It's a good deck. If you put in that time, you feel really confident with the deck. But overall, I think you are still a deck that's going to struggle in the long term in this format. Up next, we have Lugia V-Star, a deck that saw a lot of play this weekend. One of the top decks for Merida, and it kind of showed up. It didn't have any decks in the top 16, but outside of the top 16, it was nothing but Lugia, seeing tons of placements. A lot of people playing Lugia well this weekend. So for that reason, I think I will make this our first A-tier deck of the list. Up next, we have Dragapult, a deck that did not do well in the top 8, only having 1 placement at 5th overall, but just outside there in the top 16. It had 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th place. So 4 of the top 16 decks being Dragapult. I think this is another really strong play. I'm going to put it in the A tier as well. I think kind of our big 3 decks for this format are going to be Miraidon, Dragapult, and Lugia. So kind of figuring out which way you want to play that deck will be really important in this format. Up next, we have Gardevoir, a deck that is also probably getting reinvented a little bit post-rotation, but for now, the Curlia we still have access to until rotation hits. This deck had another really strong performance over the weekend, kind of cementing itself in that conversation for does it belong in the top 3 conversation for this format? Or is that still more of a Miraidon, Dragapult, Lugia conversation? But for now, Gardevoir having a really, really good placement, 1 top 8 deck, 2 in the top 16, and just a ton of placements all around day 2. This deck I am going to put in the A tier for now, but I think it is kind of the 4th best deck in this format. Up next, we have Cloth. And this deck really didn't see a ton of play this weekend. It only had 4 decks in day 2, and only one of them inside of the top 64 players. So this deck, I think, is kind of in that C tier, trying to find its footing in a Badu format, trying to figure everything out. It is a deck that can be a little clunky, just needing a lot of cards to get the Unhinged Scissor combo to really pop off for you. But if you're able to do that consistently, it can be a very good deck. Up next, a deck that I did not expect to be talking about in the Prismatic Evolutions format is Ancient Box. It's a deck that I think really does struggle against your big turbo evolution decks like Dragapult, like Charizard. Has a little better matchup in a Gardevoir just because Gardevoir has the dark weakness, so you're doing double damage. But I think overall it's probably a B tier, C tier deck. For now, I am going to put it in C tier, just because it did only have the one finish this weekend. Up next, we have Pidgeot Control. This deck had one placement in the top 32, being Pablo Meza. Obviously a very accomplished Pokemon player. So I think this deck isn't great in the format. I think it's more about the player than the deck itself. For that reason, I am going to be placing it in the C tier, kind of until someone shows me otherwise, because outside of Pablo Mesa, only having one placement in the top 64 and only two placements total in all of day 2, this deck, I think, needs to do a little more to impress me, to make me, you know, kind of really respect that. So I am putting it in the D tier. Up next is Palkia V-Star. One of these decks also trying to make that last hurrah. This weekend did not have a great weekend. It ended up getting one placement at 162nd, really struggling in day 2, only having the one deck, really just struggling to find a hold in this meta right now. For that reason, I am going to place this deck in the D tier until it kind of shows that it does belong a higher placement in the tier list. And the last deck of our tier list here is Terapagos EX. This deck, again, did not really have a great weekend. Only 2 placements total, 1 in the top 128, 2 overall. Really just a deck that I think is still also trying to find its footing, right? A deck that kind of needs to figure out how it survives in a Badu format when you don't have your Buddy Poffin, when the Noctowls aren't as impactful because I can't always just grab items. I have to think about supporters versus just grabbing the items I need, and I have to be more methodical with the way I'm grabbing things. So I think this deck will find a way, but right now it is, I think, a C tier deck, and that is the tier list, ladies, gentlemen, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. This is my tier list, how I see it going into the Puerto Rico special event this weekend. If you disagree or if you agree, let me know in the comments down below. And thank you so much for watching. We will see y'all on the next one. Peace.